Welcome to the Institute for National Security Studies Strategic Podcast Series. My name is Tuvia Gering. I'm a researcher here at the INSS Dayan and Guilford Glaser Israel-China Policy Center and a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council Global China Hub. I'm really happy to be joined today by two scholars to talk about something that may sound not too interesting, research security and integrity, but I assure you it is, and it is extremely important. To my right, I have Dr. Glenn Tiffert. He's from Hoover Institute, Stanford University, and he's an historian of modern China. He co-chairs the Hoover Project on China's global sharp power and works closely with government and civil society partners to document and build resilience against authoritarian interference with democratic institutions. Glenn is also currently serving as the executive committee of the Academic Security and Counter-Exploitation Program, an association of U.S. universities established to help heighten security awareness in academia. And we're also joined by Mr. Jeff Stoff. He's the founder and president of the newly established Center for Research, Security and Integrity, CRSI. This is a non-governmental, US-based organization, nonprofit, that is dedicated to the protection of research innovation from harmful foreign influence and interference. CRSI assists academic, government, and private sectors institutions to mitigating risk to security and integrity of research from adversarial and authoritarian nations. Jeff spent over 18 years in the US government and is a China analyst and linguist, and he is recognized as an expert on technology protection issues and has been advising government, intelligence services, and academia around the world, including here in Israel. And I'm really happy to be joined by you both. So just to get us started and give us an idea, why should we care about research security and integrity as it relates to authoritarian countries? And I'm talking about Israel, but this applies to other democracies.
Well, first, thank you very much, Tuvia, for inviting us here today. We're very much looking forward to the conversation. Research security and integrity is a subset of issues related really to China and other authoritarian nations' imperatives to try to control the information space on which global decision makers and public policy professionals and, frankly, public opinion is formed. And so authoritarian nations in particular want insights into our research security and the research that our institutions do, partly to understand how we think about them, to influence the policies that we adopt towards them, and in particular with regard to China, to do technology transfer in areas that China is weak in but seeks to dominate in. In technology transfer, particularly technologies with national security implications and economic competitiveness implications are areas of extreme concern.
And Jeff, do you have any case study or a story that keeps you up at night that made you interested in this, just to help the listeners kind of understand what we're dealing in, what we're talking about?
Yeah, when I was in the government, we looked a lot at federal scientific agencies that fund research in academia, and we found just many cases where individuals that are taking, for example, the U.S. Department of Defense funding for research, and they're extensively collaborating and working with either Chinese military organs or universities that primarily conduct defense research, including classified research programs. And strictly from a national security perspective, this is very troubling, and it represents some of the challenges that we face in fundamental research areas where it's not restricted, it's not subject to regulatory oversight. And this free and open exchange of research has very serious implications, particularly in the national security space, but not entirely in national security. So I found some of these examples, and the more we looked, the more we found. And Glenn and I actually published an initial study looking at defense-affiliated universities in collaboration with the U.S., and we were surprised at how much collaboration was taking place.
And you recently also authored a big piece looking at collaborations in Germany. And there, if I recall, you looked at 43,000 articles published in Germany or with German scholars with Chinese partners. And this probably is a good case study on the scale and scope we're talking about. Can you just run us through the findings of this report and maybe some shocking information or something that should raise alarm bells for Germany, but also for people listening here?
Yes, Now, to be clear, I did not go through all 43,000 articles one at a time. It was just me doing this work, but I did look through several thousand of them. And what I basically did was I looked at German scientific research collaboration with China, and unsurprisingly, that also involved many other European nations, Canada, the US, Australia, and in fact a number of articles with Israel as well. Given the global nature of scientific collaboration, it's not surprising that many countries are collaborating together. It's encouraged to do that. But getting to your point about the scale and the scope, I was also surprised to see how much collaboration was occurring. I looked at a 5-year period from 2016 through May of 2022, just over 5 years, and I categorized collaboration based on the Chinese entities that were involved and assessed risk that way. And from a national security standpoint, there was a substantial amount of defense collaboration with Chinese military organs, including the nuclear weapons complex and the People's Liberation Army's premier scientific and engineering institute, on a scale that I don't think even Germany understood. We found nearly 830 articles just involving PLA organs.
How do you explain that? Isn't that limited or prohibited?
I am not aware of any policy in place that restricts such collaboration if it's designated as basic or applied in fundamental research. Export control regimes don't apply in these cases. Fundamental research is defined as being something that's going to be published and shared. And so it's never been a particular policy to restrict such collaboration. And China is taking advantage of this. You had asked about a really egregious example. In addition to just having several hundred articles involving the nuclear weapons complex, there were articles involving multiple nations, the US, Germany, other European nations, with China's premier missile design academy that produces submarine-launched ballistic missiles and intercontinental ballistic missiles that have nuclear warheads attached. And they're working with this institute. And it's open and unrestricted. And my point is, maybe we need to rethink how we collaborate, and it's time to draw some red lines and say that that is not in our collective national interest to do that.
Israel's 3 primary international research partners are the United States, Germany, and China. China represents 10% of all Israeli international collaborations. And that's worth looking at very closely, because everywhere that Jeff and I look around the world, among the major Western research powers, Canada, the UK, Germany, the United States in particular, we are so integrated with China now in our research enterprise that we find the types of cases that Jeff just described everywhere we look. And it's very likely that some may be here in Israel as well. And so this is of tremendous concern because China is unlike our traditional research partners, which have always tended to be other Western liberal democracies.
But let me push back again against this for a second. Researchers here and policymakers too will tell you, what's the big problem? China is not our enemy. China is our almost biggest trade partner. It's a close collaborators. Many of these research programs started with US funding and encouragement and blessing, going back to the 70s even, but more recently in the last decade. And you get multiple funding from Israeli government, from US government, and Chinese government working in cooperation. And what's the big deal, right? After all, this was our interest all along to create these sort of collaborations. And China provides a lot of funding opportunities as well. They have brilliant scholars, and they have brilliant PhD students that come here on their own funding, on their own dime. And what changed, or has it never changed at all? I mean, where's the inflection point? That's what I'm asking.
I think you make a great point. China has brilliant researchers. Increasingly, it has world-class laboratories. In many instances, they are better appointed than laboratories in our countries. They have newer gear, fancier gear. They have large cores of talented graduate students and postdocs to do the more labor-intensive aspects of research. Purely on the merits in the sciences and in engineering, there are very strong reasons to collaborate with China. And this is why we do. For the last 40 years, we have invited China to participate in the international frameworks for research collaboration that we have constructed and that we all share, which are fundamentally premised on trust. The problem with that is China is a different type of country than the UK is, than Australia, Japan, Germany, and Israel. The state plays a different role. It has different standards of human rights. China is not a treaty ally or even a close national security partner of any of those other nations. Israel and the United States, for example, have had a very close relationship over decades. We have formal treaty alliances with Japan and with NATO. And so our relationship with those countries is one that has really deep bonds of trust, and we trust each other's motivations. China, as all are aware, particularly in the last 15 years, has demonstrated itself as an outlier in that community, particularly under Xi Jinping. And so it is important to understand that China is different and should be treated differently. We've not done that to this point. And so China is taking the technologies that it is learning and mastering in the context of those international collaborations and quite literally weaponizing them and turning them not only against us, but its own people.
Let me give you two quick examples that illustrate Glenn's point. Yes, this collaboration has been encouraged, but the party state has absolute control over and has its own motives and intentions. And those are clear in some of these collaborations. One example that involved Israel as well as Germany and the US in my Germany study involved hearing aid related research. Medical, benign, valuable work, using advanced tools like machine learning for speech understanding and signal processing. And they also were working with a Chinese partner on this collective effort. In a different case, but similar, it involved the National Institutes of Health was funding that research. But in this particular case, the Chinese partner was working for a particular university that, a subdivision of that university, the university is called Northwestern Polytechnical University, which is a civilian university that conducts defense research as its primary mission. And the department that collaborator was in, it does submarine warfare for the PLA Navy. And so China is diverting or redirecting what is honest, good, decent research and trying to use it for more nefarious reasons. Another quick example is Glenn and I published a study, and we looked at a particular AI institute at the Chinese Academy of Sciences that is a world leader in its space. It does a lot of valuable neuroscience research, brain research, and AI for good reasons, but it also simultaneously uses that research and has a national laboratory that collaborates extensively around the world, including with Israel and Western Europe and the US. And that lab is conducting mass surveillance research and redirecting that AI towards facial recognition and gait recognition and iris recognition, and has deployed some of those capabilities to China's public security apparatus.
So you mentioned a couple of actors there, including institutions that are related to the PLA, to the People's Liberation Army. But on the surface, it sounds like any collaboration with any Chinese entity could be risky, because even if it's innocuous, they can just divert it to military means. So can you just help us understand who are the real actors? Is it really true that anyone with Chinese heritage becomes a threat? Or can we pinpoint and maybe try to identify the risks and manage it even, and continue collaboration where it is in our interest? And
you raise a very important point and a huge challenge that we face in dealing with China and the party state. It is theoretically true and possible that China, given its control over its whole research ecosystem, could divert any research conducted anywhere for these nefarious purposes. That can happen. Our approach, though, but that leaves us in an impossible position of, so does that mean we just cut off all collaboration because they could divert all of it? That leads to an untenable situation where I don't think anybody wants to realistically get to that point, because, as Glenn had mentioned, there are still aspects of research collaboration that are still of value, that the Western world also appreciates and values. So my approach, suggested approach, is we can at least start with entities that we know, that we've understood, that we map out and say, well, these are clearly affiliated defense organizations, defense supporting organizations, and they should not have unfettered access to the global research enterprise. We can start with there. Like I had mentioned earlier, so for example, you have, in addition to just research institutes that are directly subordinate to the PLA, there are categories of civilian universities, for example, the 7 Sons of National Defense Universities, 7 Sons of Ordnance Industry Universities. These are civilian universities, but their primary mission is to support the defense R&D base. There are also research institutes that are not universities, but sometimes they act like them, as a research entity, but are attached to major state-owned defense conglomerates that have all these subordinate research institutes and collaborate extensively, but they're part of the defense industrial base. Those are categories of entities that I believe we should really just not engage with, because those are known to do those things. It gets a little more complicated with a lot of other civilian universities that do a lot of different kinds of research. Maybe they dabble into a little bit of defense, but they do a lot of other things that may be of value, and that requires a more nuanced approach at looking at these organizations and their personnel and what they're doing.
I would like to add a couple of things to that, because I think it's very important to state some clear principles here. Under no circumstances should we identify threats based on people's ethnicity or heritage. This is not what this is about at all. This is about a set of practices and behaviors that are state-sponsored. And they can actually be carried out by anyone. We've identified people who are not of Chinese heritage or Chinese origin who are complicit and active in supporting these types of endeavors. And so it's really important, simply because to do otherwise would be to be like China. It's inconsistent with our values and principles as liberal democracies. And so our approach to these problems has to be informed by who we are and the values that we hold dear. So it's critical to lay that down. But beyond that, for 40 years, we've had the door wide open and invited Chinese into the United States and other democracies to fully participate, partly to emulate the kinds of standards and conventions and behaviors that we think are important, in the hopes that they would be, to demonstrate them in the hopes that they would emulate them. That turned out not to be the case. So there's been a recoil from that as we've understood that China is not traveling that road. And there is, I think, an understandable overreaction, which is to slam the door shut and decouple completely. I think that would be dangerous too, because though we talk about the threats a great deal posed by state-sponsored technology transfer apparatuses, for example, there are tremendous opportunities which our nations, to collaboration, which all of our nations have benefited from. Many Chinese have come to the United States to pursue advanced education and stayed in the United States and contributed to the American economy, to our technological competitiveness. They've become American citizens. They've raised families in America. We need to honor and respect that too. And there are opportunities. This is a tremendous talent pool. If you're thinking about it purely in terms of economic competitiveness and national security, why would we not want to tap what these people can offer? In addition to, it is simply the right thing to do.
So these are the opportunities and they're clear, but the risks again, which we're focused on today, are something that it's still hard to understand. If you can perhaps tell us some of the ways that they conduct these nefarious operations, as you describe them, and perhaps help identify where opportunity lies and where the risk is. Right. And it could be not associated to the students at all. It could be conducted just in China. So just to help us understand a bit, how do they do it? What are they looking for?
So we could talk at great length about this, but in a nutshell, one useful way to explain it would be to take a look at the 14th Five-Year Plan, which was adopted in 2021. And in that 5-year plan, they list out more than 20 technological areas, very much a shopping list, in which the Chinese government at the highest levels had identified that over the next 5 years, these are the critical technologies which we do not yet master, but which we seek to master, around which we are going to mobilize tremendous resources, monetary resources, human capital, and policies to get us there, to ensure that we dominate these technologies of the future. And this is really a race for the future. They tend to be technologies that the United States has an advantage in, but not for very long if China succeeds. And so at the very top level, that signal is sent to all lower levels of the Chinese bureaucracy and state and the university system, telling them that these are the priorities that we've identified that you need to mobilize around. Then each entity and component of the Chinese government and the higher education system takes its set of responsibilities and its role in that system, mobilizes around those goals, and seeks to execute. They do it in a variety of ways. Sometimes they identify who are the key individuals abroad who are strong in this technology that we are missing.
They have like Excel files.
They have databases
and expertise.
Exactly. And they identify those individuals and institutions, and they specifically target them, either by sending graduate students to learn everything that those individuals can teach them at those universities, or extending talent program opportunities to them to get them to come to China for several months a year so that they can share their knowledge. And in any other context, this is the way that global science should operate. But that presumes that the party is a trusted partner. And China is not a trusted partner because of the way it has behaved. And I know that Jeff can add much more to that.
Yeah, it really is, and this is the challenge that we're all facing. It really is a whole-of-nation approach where the party state in the technology shopping list that Glenn just described, they're going to deploy everything from informal, open research collaboration for the knowledge, gaining knowledge of these technologies, all the way from state-sponsored cyber operations, what looks kind of like an intelligence operation to get at critical technologies and intellectual property at companies, corporate espionage that are kind of state-run. And then it runs all the way the gamut to a collusion among what would be considered competitors in industries, but they're actually working together to lure experts in Western companies' competitors to come to China via either formal means like a joint venture, and then they transfer that way, or to actually, through these talent programs, recruit key scientists and engineers and managers at these companies, and then to go and transfer that to China. And it's all very well integrated. That's not to say that they're this amazing top-down, well-managed structure. They actually have incentives in place to compete among localities to get at this, but the state provides resources, and I think a lot of Western companies and research institutes don't understand that there are nation-state resources that are being provided even at an individual, nominally private company level.
So to me, in this, just to wrap up because it's almost time, it sounds like on the one hand we have an entire party-state system all geared to this sole purpose of harvesting technology by any means, and that's also how they describe it, 多种方式, right? And on the other hand, we have Professor John Doe or Jane Doe, who just wants to do some basic research and go back home and earn his bread. And how do you even begin to cope with this kind of challenge where you have these very lopsided situation? I mean, is any government has been able to deal with this? Because we talk about the last few days about the U.S., the Netherlands, the U.K., Canada. How have they been succeeding with this approach, if at all? So just in a short.
I would say this is a huge challenge that we are working collectively. We're trying to build consortium among think tanks, NGOs, academia, and in partnership with government to tackle this. The short answer to your problem is, in my opinion, neither governments or research institutions are equipped to really get a handle on this and do not have the knowledge base or the capacity to really provide the kind of risk assessments that are needed. We are trying to build that capacity now, and it needs to be a collective effort among a lot of allied nations together with some government support, but the governments are not equipped to handle this on their own.
So Jeff and I have attacked this problem for the last few years by simply documenting it and trying to raise consciousness so we can demonstrate an empirical case that there is a problem. I believe that we've probably done that persuasively now, because now questions are being asked, so what do we do about the problem? And that is where we're tackling. That's what we're going to tackle next.
Yeah, and that's what we're doing here. So thank you very much for joining us, and I'm sure we'll talk again soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.